It's good to see you tonight. It's good to also have many visitors with us. But a lot of you we just consider to be family. So thank you for being here. I had no idea today was Father's Day until a couple of days ago. I wrote this sermon weeks ago for tonight, not knowing it was Father's Day. I had come home and someone had ripped a door off my kitchen, and no one knows who did it. The dog got blamed. The next day, well, not the next day, a couple days later, I came home and the screen door had been so forced open for so long that it warped the door and now it doesn't close right. After my investigation, apparently the dog again is to blame. Tonight I'd like to present 6 passages that keep my sanity while raising little children. I feel like I'm a little qualified now to speak about this. And I know that this sermon is very specific in nature, but regardless, these 6 passages hold weight for all disciples. And even if you're not in a specific situation where you are having to raise little children at this moment, or you never have in the past, or you never will, which is fine, there's still good discipleship thoughts in here and something we can all glean, because when you look at several of these Old Testament passages especially, they're going to talk about how God views us as little children. And there's something to learn about God's nature by what he instructs parents of young children to do. It was really to my surprise that God does spend several times addressing young parents. And I never really even considered it until I was a young parent. And I was trying to figure things out. But there's several times in the Old Testament that God gets very specific to young parents of young children. And I found these passages to be very helpful. Many of y'all know that have done this before. You know that they will test you. And they will make you question your sanity. I mean, they really can drive you to really crazy places. If you don't have some kind of foundation before you start having young children, they will topple that foundation. And they'll topple it pretty quickly. Especially twins. They're a whole nother level. You know, they're double. If you remember in the Bible, when Rebecca asked the Lord and inquired, "What's wrong with me?" What did God tell her? Well, what's wrong with you is you're having twins. And they're already fighting now. And I can tell you, at 4 months old, they already start fighting each other. They do it. But God has prepared us for even very strange situations like this. And I just want to look at these 6 passages, and the lesson will be yours. The first passage that I thought that has really helped me is Isaiah chapter 40. And I've got the verse up here on the screen, but you're welcome to look at your Bible as well. Isaiah chapter 40 is the very famous passage where Isaiah ends with, those that wait on the Lord, they shall renew their strength, they shall mount up with wings like eagles. We're very familiar with the last verse of that chapter. But earlier in the chapter, he basically explains that God is a shepherd to Israel, and he gets specific about he understands those that have young. In Isaiah 40, starting in verse 9, he says, "O Zion, you who bring good tidings, get up in the high mountain, O Jerusalem. You who bring good tidings, lift up your voice with strength. Lift up, be not afraid. Say to the cities of Judah, behold your God. Behold, the Lord God has come with a strong hand, and his arm shall rule for them. Behold, his reward is with him, and his work before him. He will feed his flock like a shepherd. He will gather the lambs with his arm, and carry them in his bosom, and gently lead those who are with young." I preached Isaiah 40 last year sometime, and someone walked up to me who is another young parent and said, "Is verse 11 saying what I think it's saying?" And I was like, "Yeah, I think verse 11 is saying what you think it's saying." When you got here at verse 10, "Behold, the Lord God shall come to you with a strong hand. He'll roll over you." But look, he got good work. Verse 11, he's going to feed his flock like a shepherd. And the thought is, and we are very familiar with this thought, is that God is the shepherd and we're his sheep. Some of the sheep need to be fed. He feeds them. Some of them need to be gathered up with his arms, right? And he needs to manually get in there and shove them in the right direction. And he does that for his people. Some of them need to be carried. And some of them have young with them, and he understands that that's difficult, and so he gently leads them. Many of you may remember in Genesis as well, Jacob is approached by Esau on his way back home, and Esau has all the guys. Jacob's scared. He sends gifts. They end up working out, ends up being okay. Esau says, "Jacob, just come with me, and I'll take you home right now." And what does Jacob respond with? He says, "No, I got sheep with their young, and I can't travel that fast. And so Jacob is the good physical shepherd here. He says, no, I got sheep with baby sheep. We can only walk so fast, and we're not going to abandon them. And certainly God has the very same aspect for his saints that have young as well. And how does that look in real life? Well, I can tell you this. When I was 24 years old, I'd come here and take the Lord's Supper with y'all, and I would bow my head, and I would meditate, and I would focus about the Lord's death. I proclaim his death till he comes, and I maybe even would read a passage or read a hymn that had to do with the Lord's death. Do I do that now? No, I do not. And I know that this is temporary, but unless Emily's parents are with us, I eat the Lord's Supper. I do my best, but most of the time I just wrestle. I wrestle for however long we get there. And that's just the way it is right now. Does God understand that? Well, he gently leads those that are with young, right? There was a time I used to listen to Jason's sermons. For about the past 8 months, I've gotten bits and pieces of Jason's sermons. And I talked to him and then, hey, I really like this part. I don't know what else you talked about because I've got to go out 4 times. But, does God understand when we're in those situations? Yeah, he does. I used to look forward to gospel meetings. And now I just try to get through gospel meetings. And I understand that, when you do have young children, they just don't understand why we keep on coming back. The easy thing to do would just be not to come. But I don't want to set a standard here this early on that we go to church only when it's easy. So we go now. Do I learn anything necessarily at the meeting? Not necessarily. Do I get this big thought that was presented for 40 minutes? No, not necessarily. All I really get is to say that the church assembled and we were there. But does God understand that? Will he accept that? I think God will accept that. And Isaiah 40 gives me a lot of comfort about that. He knows that those that are leading young, and he can gently lead those who still have very young. And just to one thing of this, he knows this is a temporary situation. You're not going to have young children forever. And when you got 8-year-olds and 7-year-olds that can sit here quietly and behave the whole time, why was that happening? That was because you implemented some things when they were 1 year old, 2 years old, 3 years old. If you wait till they're 9 or 10 to get them to obey, it's too late. Because we can go find some random 10-year-old, he'd be talking all through this right now, wouldn't he? So certainly it's temporary, but God can handle that temporary time. And that gives me a lot of confidence. Here's passage number 2, Psalm 78. I think there's a thought here that improvement over time is going to happen. And of course, it's expected. Psalm 78 gives parents a job to do. I'm going to start here at the top in verse 5. Talking about God, he says, for he established a testimony in Jacob and appointed a law in Israel, which he commanded our fathers that we should make them known to their children, that the generation to come might know them, the children who would be born, that they may arise and declare them to their children, that they may set their hope in God and not forget the works of God, but keep his commandments, and may not be like their fathers, a stubborn and rebellious generation, a generation that did not set its heart aright, and those whose spirit was not faithful to God. The first thing I want to bring out here is verse 7, what I have emboldened. This is the job of a parent, that they may set their hope in God. This is what they teach their children, not to forget the works of God, right? And number 3, to keep God's commandments. That's the job of a parent, to instill that in their children. And y'all that have been parents, when does that start happening? That might start happening before they're even 1. And I didn't even understand this, but the ability they have to pick up on things and learn is scary. And once they start saying words, they'll start talking to you. If you say a word, what do children end up saying right back? They'll say that word back. You start realizing you're walking around with a recorder. And that's scary, because a lot of times the thing that they pick up first is the thing that you weren't glad that you said. And you especially weren't happy about it when they said it back. When do you start teaching children that your hope is in God and their hope should be in God? That's on day 1. That's why we go to the gospel meeting, even though we don't get anything out of it. Because I trust in this Creator. And if these are his people and he wants me to assemble, I'm going to be here and I'm going to assemble because I put my hope in this God, right? When do we start teaching them the works of God? That's when we start teaching them the stories. And it doesn't have to be, these really hard stories we've been doing in Judges, especially at the end. We start teaching them about Noah. We start teaching them about Abraham. We start, of course, teaching them about Jesus and Peter and Paul. What are we teaching them? We're teaching them wonderful works of God. Do we teach them to keep his commandments? Yeah, we do. And that may start with, we don't eat the dog food because Daddy said so. Now, that may not be the most important commandment there is, but that's a starting point. We're going to obey parents. I don't want you to eat dog food. Guess what? You're not going to eat dog food today. Sorry, Clark. We start them very young. And of course, these things grow and they develop, and these things become more serious and more involved as the older they get. I also want to point out this part. The beginning of verse 7 starts with this, that they may arise and declare them to their children. And those are the three things, right? They may set their hope in God, not forget the works of God, but keep his commandments. And now look at the next phrase. And may not be like their fathers. What's the psalm actually about? It's about improvement over time. There's one aspect I can just say that it does get easier over time. And it is very difficult at the beginning, but the more and longer you're a parent, there is some easier things that come about, even though there are different challenges that arise. I remember when I first was with my firstborn and Emily would leave, I would probably make it 45 minutes before I called Emily and asked her to come back. And I remember I used to sit there with Ruby in my lap on the couch, and we would just sit there, and she would look at me, and I would look at her, and I was scared to death to move. But now I got one kid in a laundry hamper. I got one kid in the dog food, and me and Ruby are dancing, watching Bluey. It gets better over time. And again, like I said, a lot of these things and these stresses that come about, they are temporary. But here's even a bigger thought. Some of us not necessarily had good childhoods. And I understand that. And that's why you don't hear me and Jason come up here during Mother's Day and Father's Day and give you these rosy sermons about how wonderful parents are, because we understand in the real world, we all didn't live in that reality. But if you had a terrible childhood, do you have to pass that down to your children? What is the psalm about? That you would not be like your fathers, but that our children would be better than us. And there's even a thought that, and then our children would do a better job than we did of raising them. Why is this all possible? I think it's because of verse 5. Because he established a testimony in Jacob. There's the main father right there. And that father passed down, and there was improvement over time that, of course, was expected. That's a passage that gives me some hope and some confidence and a job to do. Here's Psalm 127. This might be one of the most famous ones that we're familiar with. But the psalmist here, this is one of the Psalm of Ascents. The thought is that this is what families could sing as they were traveling to the temple. Some of them are written by David. It seems like most of them are written by Solomon. This is what's said in verse 3. And I think verse 3 is what we're most familiar with. I'm going to start there in the middle of my passage. He says, behold, children are a heritage from the Lord. NET says, children are a gift from God. The fruit of the womb is a reward. Like arrows in the hands of a warrior, so are the children of one's youth. Happy is the man who has his quiver full of them. They shall not be ashamed, but shall speak with their enemies in the gate. Verse 3 is the more famous line, that children are a blessing from God. That's what people tell you at Costco when your children are acting terrible, and they think it helps. That's kind of like the kind of key verse people go to. But to take some notes from these things, when you get to verse 4, and I understand we can make a very powerful point that, generally, life is a gift from God, and Andrew's never going to debate against that. Human life is a gift from God. But verse 4, there's a thought here. The thought is they're a gift from God because they're like arrows in the hands of a warrior. And y'all have probably heard this explained before. The concept is they're an offensive weapon that moves into the future. That's why it's archery. That I can affect things not just far away from me, but far away in time from me. Well, how do I affect those things far away from me? Well, I instill those values in my children. And once my children become my age, they go out and do the works that I would do, and that's me shooting arrows, right? Verse 5, happy is a man who has a quiver full of them. So the thought is like, hey, lucky you had twins. You got two. It's supposed to be this thought. This is this happy thought that you've got multiple children. That's a good thing. And there in the middle right there, so are the children of one's youth. This is another time he's specific, and he talks about young parents, right? That this is a young man in his 20s or his 30s and he has children. That's a good thing. There's almost a comparison to a famous Genesis line when Jacob tells Joseph, you are the child of my age, or you're the child of me being elderly. Well, here's the other way around. This is the children of one's youth. And now there's no reason to be ashamed because when the enemies come against your gates, you have all these children that are going to protect you. This is a good passage. Let's wear it out. Let's continue to use it. I want us to consider this, though. The way the passage is set up, if you read the whole psalm, is a conditional passage. It's not just like a straight off, like children are a gift from God, because let's face it, every little child, do you think that they act like they're a gift from God? I'll be admitted, there's little children I know that are a terror. And they have fathers that is not happy they have a quiver full of them. And to their own fault. It's not the kid's fault, it's the parents' fault. But not necessarily just because they're little kids means that they're good. And maybe because of their raising, they're a terror. Well, why is that? It's because this psalm is a conditional statement. Look at verse 1. Unless the Lord builds the house, they labor in vain who build it. Unless the Lord guards the city, the watchman stays awake in vain. It is vain for you to rise up early, to sit up late, to eat the bread of sorrows. For so he gives his beloved sleep. Behold, children are a gift from the Lord. And I don't think these, it's a 6-verse psalm or 5-verse psalm. I don't think there's a break here. I think it's the same thought. The thought is, it doesn't matter how hard you work on your house. It doesn't matter how many times, and I really think verse 2 is kind of the talk about, the metaphor is the city, but really the thought is how you raise your children. What do? You have to rise up early because they get you up at 5, no matter what. Whether you sit up late because they won't go to bed. Whether you eat the bread of sorrows. Sometimes when you're feeding the kids, you forget to eat or you don't get to eat, right? Do you get to sleep? No, you don't get to sleep. And you put all this effort and energy into the children, but unless the Lord had built the house, what is it all for? It's all in vain. And I think that's actually the message of the psalm. Who is the man who's happy that he has a quiver full? It's the man who lives in the house that the Lord built. That's the man who's actually happy. This is a conditional statement. And I think that's very important. When you have little kids, people will start pushing stuff on you early, and it's not necessarily bad advice. People say, well, all right, we'll go ahead and start a college fund. Maybe you can have some growth there, right? A lot of us consider, is there any way we can get them in some kind of pre-K program? Any way we can kind of get them ready for kindergarten? Man, they're going to be 2 years old going to school eventually. We're going to call it pre-K, right? You think, I got to feed my baby the best food, and this is the best food I can feed my baby. They're going to be so healthy, yada, yada, yada. All those things can be great things, but unless the Lord built your house, does it matter? It doesn't matter at all. Because unless the Lord's in the home, all that labor is in vain. This passage gives me some hope. If I can at least get the Lord in my house, maybe it doesn't matter how well they are prepared for kindergarten. And maybe it doesn't matter if they just at least have full bellies. Because if the Lord's in my house, well then, children are a heritage from the Lord. And happy is the man who has a quiver full of them. Here's the next passage. Very convenient. It's actually the next chapter. It's almost like this is what Solomon was talking about. For the children to be well behaved, the parent must fear the Lord. Read this psalm with me. Blessed is everyone who fears the Lord, who walks in his ways. When you eat the labor of your hands, you shall be happy, and it shall be well with you. Your wife shall be like a fruitful vine in the very heart of your house. Your children like olive plants all around your table. Behold, thus shall the man be blessed who fears the Lord. The Lord blesses you out of Zion, and may you see the good of Jerusalem all the days of your life. Yes, may you see your children's children. Peace be upon Israel. When you especially look here in verse 2 and 3, what's the setting that he builds here? He builds this thought that this is a guy, and he goes and he works, and he gets to eat the labor of his hands. And he's happy. And I think that's kind of the real key thought here is that this guy's actually happy. He's happy to go home. He's happy to go to work. He's very happy to be home. Why? Because that's where his wife and his children are. And he says in verse 3, his wife is like the very heart of her house. The thought is that the wife is happy and she's productive. She's getting things done. That doesn't mean she's getting huge things done. It may be that she just fed all the kids that day, and hey, that's a success. But she's, happy as well. She's the heart of the home. What are the children like? There's a picture here that the children are around the table. And what are they like? They're like olive trees that have been in little pots. And there's a thought there that the olive tree also produces something good. And I think maybe this is one that works also for older children. They got something done today. But I also think that there's a very beautiful thought of coming home and sitting at a table together, and you're happy and mom's happy. And what are all the kids behaving like? They're behaving like potted plants. And it's quiet. Now, I'll be completely honest with you. This is not my home. I got one kid that's always screaming. I got one kid that's always crying. And I have one at the table that just smacks the table. And I also feel a little bit better about that because when you get to verse 5, and the NET says this as well, this isn't necessarily describing how it should be. It seems like this is a blessing. It's a prayer that may your house be like this. And I think that's really the thought here because no matter how strong you are going to have some terrible nights. This isn't like guaranteed, but you can't have little glimpses of your kids acting like potted plants. But what's the only, again, condition that it actually happens? Verse 1, blessed is everyone who fears the Lord, who walks in his ways. Can that man have well-behaved children? Yes, he can. Can that mother have well-behaved children? Yes, she can, because she fears the Lord. Look at verse 4. Behold, thus shall the man be blessed who fears the Lord. And I think the thought very simply is this. If you don't respect the Lord, your children aren't going to respect you. If you don't know how to behave yourself, why in the world would your children behave for you? They won't, right? Like, there's no reason for them to. And a lot of the ways that we treat those in authority over us is really what we're going to be handing down to the next generation. If you respect the Lord, the children can respect you. If you don't respect the Lord, maybe this isn't going to work out the way that you want it to. And I'll just finish it with this. Look at verse 6. Yes, may you see your children's children. Why am I trying my best now to get them at least to behave just a little bit? Well, because one day, Lord willing, I want my grandkids to come over and I want them to behave a little bit. And why is it if my grandkids behave a little bit? Well, it's because I put the effort in now to get my children to behave today. So blessed is the man that gets to see his children's children. And they're their own little potted plants. And ultimately, what are they? They're happy. And I leave it one more thought with this. The only way that happiness is found in this earth begins with the way the Proverbs also begin. It begins with fearing the Lord. That's where happiness ultimately comes from, respecting God, and that's where all the good things ultimately will come from. Here's passage number 5. Little children, help me understand God. Deuteronomy 1:31, and I want to ultimately work there, but let me walk there with 2 proverbs, 2 familiar proverbs. Proverbs 13:24, he who spares his rod hates his son, but he who loves him disciplines him promptly. And I want to start with this. The first phrase, he who spares his rod hates his son. The thought is like the opposite of the Hebrews writer in chapter 12. The Lord loves whom he chastens, right? And since he chastens you, then you must be his sons. If you don't discipline your children and you don't get involved when they do something wrong. I had a kid the other day that picked up a handful of sand and threw it in another kid's face. Like if you don't do anything, do you love your child? No, you don't. Because they're starting fights and you're not even trying to stop it, right? And then even the next phrase, but he who loves him disciplines him promptly. You cannot punish a 2-year-old for something they did 2 hours ago because they don't remember. So what's the thought? The thought is it's got to be prompt. It's got to be immediate. And I know y'all with older children, you can kind of push it out. We can talk and have conversations, stuff like that. But with young children, I think that's very true. You have to be prompt. You have to be immediate. You have to get off the couch and fuss at them. Put them in timeout. Do something. Because in 30 minutes, they ain't going to remember what you're talking about. I mean, the short-term memory is very, very tiny. Now, when it comes to stuff like grandma gives them candy, for some reason, that memory, that's for years, you know? But when it comes to little things like that, they'll look at you like you don't even know what you're talking about. There's a promptness here that does take a lot of effort. Here's the other famous proverb, Proverb 23. Do not withhold correction from a child, for if you beat him with a rod, he will not die. You shall beat him with a rod and deliver his soul from Sheol. Number one, I understand, like I said already, not all of us had rosy childhoods. And I understand there's people in this room that were abused. I understand that there are people that were abused in this room and their parents used these passages to justify that abuse. I understand those things. That was not right. That was wrong. And really, if you were disciplined by spanking as a child and you still to this day resent your parents for it, they probably didn't do it right. Because in other situations where I think the situations were handled correctly, you have children that were disciplined in that manner and they love their parents today. And they might even recall some of those spankings and they'll laugh about it and talk about how justice was served. Those are two different family situations. One of them is obeying these passages. The other one obviously is provoking their children for wrath, and we'll talk about that one later. But I do understand that when we talk about this. The thought is here, though, if you beat him with a rod, he will not die. Now, number two, I understand that ultimately sometimes we explain this passage with, if you spank them, it will not kill them. Get over it. And I understand in wisdom spaces, I wouldn't disagree with that either. It will not kill them if you do this the right way. But I really think that's not what this passage is mainly talking about. When you add the second verse, if you beat him with a rod, he will not die. You will beat him with the rod and deliver his soul from death. I think the thought there with he will not die is instead the purpose of whippings is to keep them alive. That's the purpose. If they get in trouble because they threw sand in a kid's face, what's the point of that? I don't want you to be an adult and go throw sand in someone else's face and they murder you, right? If you take off in the street after I told you to stop and wait for me and you get a spanking, what's the purpose? I don't want you to run in the street and get hit by a car and die. If I spank you or I'll pop your hand, very little innocent stuff, because you were playing in the fireplace, what's the purpose of that? So you won't die. That's the purpose of these things. Better to have a rod now than die later. And I think that needs to be the thought process with that. The only bits of advice I could give with the discipline stuff, and it's not my own advice, I'm working with someone else's, is that it's very easy to discipline them this way when they're in danger. And people ask times like, well, when should I start popping their hand? And I get it, when they're babies, you don't do anything like that. But when do I start popping your hands? I think the answer is when they start doing things that's dangerous. That's good. And again, I don't have a pastor for that. That's wisdom from a different father. The other one I've been told, and I think is good advice, is there should always be an ability to escalate the situation. If you're the type of parent that is disciplined level 11 every time they do everything, you have removed yourself the ability to escalate the discipline. So if you're just coming down with whippings, and that's the worst thing in your mind that you can do for every little thing, what you've done is you remove the power away from the discipline because it's all you ever do. You got to have some way you can walk up to that. Maybe the first thing is just, hey, let's have a conversation about it. Maybe number two is, now we're going to have a serious conversation about it. Maybe number three is, now we're going to have a timeout. Maybe number four is, we're going to have a spanking. You work your way up. You don't just go to number 11 every time. And certainly, I think those kind of wisdom little things from other parents do work really well with this with Proverbs 22. And if any of y'all have any questions about this, I will send you to Rusty, and he'll answer all your questions about that. Because I don't have an earthly idea. And I guess Rusty will send you to Clayton, right? And then Clayton will send you, you get it. So these are things that we figure out, we'll work out over time. But certainly there are biblical things that God gave us some direction for. But kind of leading that discipline thought up, let's look at this passage, Deuteronomy 131. Starting in 29, then I said to you, do not be afraid or afraid of them. The Lord your God who goes before you, he will fight for you, according to all you did in the Egypt before your eyes. In the wilderness where you saw how the Lord your God carried you as a man carries his son. And all the way that you went you until you came to this place, yet for all that, you did not believe the Lord your God. What event is Moses talking about? He's talking about the Exodus. And what's the metaphor that's used to explain the Exodus? He explains it as if a father who had to carry his son all the way here. Are we talking about big kids or little kids? We're talking about little kids that can be carried. God says, you are my toddlers. And I had to herd you all the way to Exodus and ultimately all the way to Israel. Ultimately, I had to carry you because you stopped walking. You know, when you're driving in the car home and you hear, Daddy, I'm thirsty, and you say, okay, baby, when we get home, the first thing we'll do is I'll get you something to drink. Okay. What is it going to be, 5 seconds later? Daddy, I'm thirsty. I heard you the first time, baby, we're going to get you something to drink. Daddy, I'm very thirsty. You know, when you're driving home and you hear, Daddy, I'm hungry. Well, here, baby, here's a snack I got you before we left. Daddy, I'm not hungry for that. Right? When you experience those little things, what are you getting taste of? You're getting little taste of how God deals with us. Now, you're not getting the big blow, you're getting a little taste of it. But we get to understand God's nature a little bit, especially during these events, because of the metaphors he uses in Scripture to equate them. And that was very similar. Ultimately, and I've only had to threaten this once, but didn't have to do it. You go into a friend's house, you know, we're going to Archer's house is what we say. We're going to grandmama's house, and they're being terrible. Dads, sometimes what do we threaten to do in the car? You say one more thing, I'm turning this car around and we're going home. And sometimes it backfires. Sometimes they say, oh, I do want to go home, you know. But you know, most of the time, you know, ultimately during the Exodus, what did God do? He turned the car around. They were being so bad, he said, we're not going to the promised land. I'll try with your kids. We're going home. You know, when we have these little moments like this, well, little children, they help me understand God's character. And maybe that's another way that they're a blessing. Of course, when these things are combined with scriptural references that he explains himself. Here's one more, and it's Ephesians chapter 5. I think Ephesians 5 teaches me that a father is a child's first depiction of God, and a mother is a child's first depiction of the church. And I think I can be bold to say that because of how Ephesians 5 ends. If you may remember several months ago, Jason used this and made this point. He said, for this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh, explaining the Genesis line when Adam and Eve were immediately married. Moses quotes this, verse 32. This is a great mystery, but I speak concerning Christ and the church. And if you remember, Jason explained that, you know, really what this was a prophecy of God and his church. This is the way it's going to look. And the marriage relationship was the original. It was the depiction of it, right? We learn something about God and his church by looking at marriage. Then you have passages like this right after in chapter 6. And you fathers, do not provoke your children to wrath, but bring them up in the training and the admonition of the Lord. If marriage is a shadow of Christ and his church, and you're dealing with little kids that can't read, they're not going to read the Bible for themselves. You know, they wouldn't even know who God is unless you had told them about him. What's the first depiction, whether good or bad? Are they going to first understand God and his church? Well, it's going to be the relationship between mom and dad. That's the first way they're going to see God and his church, for good or for bad. When you have fathers here, do not provoke your children to wrath, but raise them up in the training and admonition of the Lord. If you're a type of father that's neglectful and you don't try and you don't put any effort to it, and instead you provoke your children to wrath to the point that they don't trust you, should we be surprised that later on down that road, that child has a very difficult time trusting God? Was there not a reason that Jesus introduced us to God as our Father in heaven? You know, the relationship a little child has with his father is really the very first depiction they learn to understand authority. You know, that's it. That's the first depiction. I understand not everybody has good situations. Timothy was someone that I think Luke implies did not have a good situation like that, but this is what God had intended. that the way that I love and I trust my Father ultimately carried over to my love and my trust I have for the Father in heaven. That's why it's important for me not to be a bully, but instead to be a father, because this is trying to give them a head start to learn how this relationship works. What about mom? Mom's the same way with the church. Mom teaches you how to be social. She teaches you how to be kind. She especially teaches you how to be empathetic and constantly consider others. What are you learning how to do? You're learning how to be cared and concerning for the church. This is very important. Very early on, we show them what the real image of these things should be. And ultimately, just to put Proverbs 31 on there, verse 28, her children rise up and call her blessed. Her husband goes out and he praises her. Many daughters have done well, but you excel them all. But a woman who fears the Lord, she shall be praised, right? But really there, verse 29, why do the children rise up and call this mother blessed? Is it not because dad says things like, many daughters have done well, but you excel them all? Is that not the thought here? Why do the children know to treat their mother with respect and love and care? Because dad treats her with love and respect and care. And what are you ultimately learning when you see dad treat mom with love and respect and care? Oh, that's how God treats his church. There's important gospel messages when you have little children. And it's sort of the very first depictions they have of them, whether for good or for bad. I have one son, and I'm going to not say his name, who screams constantly. I mean, maybe like 80% of the day. Like he just screams. Even Ruby calls it his crying corner. She's like, Dad, will you go put him in his crying corner? When you and me can go outside and go play, because I can't deal with him anymore. Ruby can't deal with him. I can't deal with him. Emily struggles to deal with him. Luna definitely can't deal with him, the dog. Luna's always like, get me away from him. When you have a little child screaming at you all day and you get to bed or you get to the afternoon, you're done. And sometimes when you've been so tired of being abused by an 8-month-old, you start to take it out on each other. And even Ruby gets involved. I mean, she takes it out on us too. I mean, because we've just all had enough and we're taking it out on each other. And I do my best. I do my best to tell Emily, and we talk about it sometimes, we are not each other's enemy. We are on the same team with the same mission, and the children are the enemy. And it's you and me versus them. And certainly, it is learning, a very hard lesson again, that this is how God treats his church. He's not enemies with us. He doesn't tell us things to hurt our feelings. This is how God works with his church. We and God, we're a team, right? And we're going to go out and we're going to do the work we can to the best of our ability. Thank you for your close attention. Ask Chris to sing this song, Because He Lives. And ultimately, we believe that little children can face uncertain days because he lives. If there's anyone here, though, is subject to the gospel and the invitation, if you need to obey Jesus Christ and put on him in the waters of baptism, or if you need the prayers of the saints, why don't you come forward as we stand and sing.